We're back with our sourdough starter. After about 3 days it started to bubble. It was bubbling lightly on top. So as I talked about in the last episode, I threw out half of it and fed it exactly what we originally fed it, 50, 50, 100. So here I want to show you, I fed this a day ago. It's not as obvious with the bubbles on top, but on the side, it's very obvious. You can see this. So this is why I suggest a clear container so you can see the gas bubbles and that your sourdough starter is alive. Okay, I'm going to feed it again, and probably in about another day we'll be ready to cook something with it. I'll be back with you then. MultiGeek here. We're back with our sourdough starter that we started last week. So it took about 3 days before it was bubbling, and then I've been feeding it every day since then. Yesterday I fed it twice at 12-hour intervals because it was growing very quickly. Today it's a little past its peak. It was up about here, but it's still in good shape to make something. So there are lots of recipes for sourdough bread, so I don't think you need help on that, but here's a nice sourdough banana nut muffin. All right, let's get started. This recipe uses a standard baking technique. There's a dry bowl and a wet bowl. You put all the dry ingredients in the dry bowl and all the wet ingredients in the wet bowl. You mix each bowl individually and then you mix them together. So here's our dry bowl. It has a cup of flour. I'm using spelt. You can use whole wheat. The recipe I'm going to post uses 50-50 white and brown. Oh, that brings back our formula. Remember our 50-50-100 recipe for the starter and feeding? So, a cup of flour, a teaspoon of baking soda, a half teaspoon of salt, and the dry bowl gets mixed together. Right? In the wet bowl, we have 3 bananas. These are very ripe. This is a quarter cup of brown sugar. The recipe calls for a half. I find that all American desserts are too sweet for me if I use the amount of sugar called for. So the first time I make them, I cut the sugar in half. If it's still too sweet, I cut it again. So there's a quarter cup of brown sugar. 2 tablespoons of oil. The recipe calls for coconut oil. I'm using olive oil. I really don't think it matters a lot. And then it calls for a teaspoon of vanilla. Now most muffin recipes would call for an egg or 2. I'm eating mostly vegan these days, so I'm using what's called a vegan egg. Well, what's a vegan egg? It's an egg substitute made out of flax. So it's a tablespoon of flaxseed, 3 tablespoons of water. You let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes. It gets all sticky, and in it goes. Now you may be thinking, what about that starter? Well, instead of throwing half of it out, feeding it, we're going to put about half of it in here, which I'm guessing is around a cup. I may have used a little more. And after I get this recipe made, I'll feed it with 50-50-100. Okay, we mixed the dry bowl. Now we're going to mix the wet bowl. I'm going to use an immersion blender, but you could use a stand mixer or anything you like. Okay, that looks pretty good. Still a little chunky on the banana side. I like it that way. So I'm just going to stay with the immersion blender, and I add part of the dry at a time. Now, as always, I finish this with a little hand mix. So if you're using a spoon for your starter like I am, don't put the spoon back in the starter because now it has all these other things on it. And then I finish the mix, scraping down the sides for our muffin batter. Looks pretty good. If you've made muffin or cake batter, you know that looks just about right. And then what's missing from banana nut muffins? Nuts. I used about 3/4 of a cup of walnuts. Chopped up. And there we go. Now, this can go straight in the muffin tins into the oven, or you can let it rise a little bit because it has a living yeast culture in it. So it'll get a little puffier and have a bit more sourdough flavor if you let it sit for a while. So I'm going to let it sit for an hour or 2, check it, and then come back and put it in the oven. All right, it's 2 hours later now. I let the batter rise for 2 hours. You can see it's a bit bubbly. We're getting some of the gas bubbles like the starter on top. So this will be a little lighter than if I just let it sit, and it'll have a little more sourdough flavor. So into the greased muffin tins it goes. I just spray these with a little nonstick. It's gonna take about 15 or 20 minutes in the oven, and I'll come back when they come out. About 22 minutes in a 400-degree oven set on convection, and they look great. I use the traditional cake tester. Sometimes old technology is best. Let me know how yours turn out. MultiGeek out.